And we're continuing with the 8th chapter of Silver on the Tree, which is called Three from the Track. The Drew children and John Rowlands are out on the jetty kind of talking about the nature of Will, the nature of Bran, and John Rowlands has begun to wax poetical about what the W River used to look like. And as Jane started to look at a seagull, we went into ellipses and there was a paragraph break, and now we will pick up. And when Jane brought her gaze down again from watching it, she saw the wooden beams of the jetty black beneath her feet, stacked with rows of gray-blue slate, and beyond the river a tall ship coming in close toward land, flapping and creaking as men hauled down her sails. Jane stood motionless, staring. She heard laughter and shrill voices, and milling round her on the jetty came a gaggle of small boys, pushing and hopping and thrusting, first one another aside in perilous clamor along the edge. Firsties, get off my foot, Freddie Evans. Look out, don't shove. There was a mixture, clean and grubby, barefoot and booted, and one of them, yellow-haired, bumping and laughing. Among the rest was her brother, Barney. Jane could only think ridiculously, but in those days they'd have been speaking Welsh. Further along the jetty she could see Simon talking earnestly in a group of 2 or 3 boys his own age. They turned to watch the ship draw gradually closer. With a snapping rush of canvas, her mainsail came down in a heap, to be seized and furled. She was a brigantine, square-rigged on the foremast, and fore and aft-rigged on the main, and only 2 foresails now hung billowing to draw her inshore. Her figurehead glinted beneath jutting bowsprit. Her figurehead glinted beneath the jutting bowsprit, a life-size girl with streaming golden hair. On the bow, Jane could read the name now, Frances Amelia. "Carrying timber," John Rowland's deep voice said beside her. "See some of it stowed there on the deck, mostly for John Jones, the builder. That will be, he has been expecting it, a cargo of yellow pine from Labrador." Jane glanced at him. His face was tranquil, his pipe was still clenched between his teeth. But on the hand that reached up to the pipe now, there was tattooed between the knuckles a small blue star that she had not seen before. And at his throat he wore the wing collar and high-necked jacket of the 19th century. He had become someone else, belonging to this other time, and yet somehow was still himself as well. Jane shivered and closed her eyes for a moment, and did not look down to see how she herself was dressed. Then there was a flurry and a sudden shriek from the edge of the jetty, where more and more people had gathered. Peering vainly past the heads, Jane could see only that the brigantine had begun to dock, lines flying down from bow and stern to be caught and made fast by darting figures ashore. From the end of the jetty, where the small boys had gone running, there came out a group of women, a noisy, scolding eruption, and all at once Barney and another boy, both very white in the face, were being dragged back toward Jane by a bustling, distressed woman in bonnet and shawl. It was recognizably Bloodwind Rowlands, yet a Bloodwind Rowlands who did not seem to know Jane as Jane. She spoke to the world at large, scolding yet in warm concern. "Always the same it is, this silly game to be first to touch the ship that comes in. And all of them in the way they're hindering the men. One day one of them is going to get killed, and it was as near as a whistle for these 2 today. Did you see them? Right on the edge, losing their balance. The side of the boat like to crush them against the jetty. If there had been no one there to grab them out of it. Ah!" She gave each boy a little exasperated shake. "Have you forgotten last week when Ellis Williams fell in? And Freddie Evans the week before," said the boy with Barney, in a pert, lilting voice. "And much worse that, because Evans the barber was waiting for him with a strap when he got out and beat him all the way home." "Mr. Evans to you, you young monkey," said Mrs. Rowlands, trying to suppress a smile. She gave Jane a little humorous shrug, released the boys with one finger wagging at them, as she turned and went back to the group of women greeting sailors on the ship. "I like her," Barney said cheerfully. "She probably saved my life, you know that," and he grinned at Jane, and ran off with the other boys, disappearing along the road behind the great stacks of slate. Jane turned to call, but no sound came. Beside her, John Rowlands was shouting to one of the men aboard the Frances Amelia. Eston Davis. Evan boy, the man called back, white teeth flashing. And even while the name puzzled her, Jane thought about this again, of the strangeness that there was no Welsh to be heard, and then suddenly knew that of course all the speaking that she could hear was indeed in Welsh, her own included, with no word of English used anywhere at all. After all, she said shakily, knowing with no reason that Simon was now at her side, turning to him, it's no more odd to understand a language that you don't know than to be switched into a time before you were born. No, Simon said, so reassuringly his own that Jane felt. No, Simon said in a voice so reassuringly his own that Jane felt dissolved in relief. No, not really odd at all. John Rowlands called beside them. What's the news of the Sarah Ellen? The man started. You haven't heard? A letter sent from Dublin was the last. It came yesterday. The man on the Francis Amelia paused, put down the line he was coiling, called a few words to someone else on board, and leapt over the gunwale and down to the jetty. He came up to John Rowlands, his face lined with concern. Bad news, Evan Rowlands, very bad. I am sorry. The Sarah Ellen founded off Skye 2 days ago with all hands, we heard yesterday. Oh, my God, John Rowlands said. He put out a hand gropingly and clutched the man's arm for an instant, and then turned and moved away, stumbling as if he were suddenly old. His face was grey and hurt. Jane longed to go after him, but she could not move. How was it possible to comfort grief that was naked on a living face, and yet had been gone and forgotten for 100 years? Which was more real, her own bewilderment, or Evan Rowland's pain looking out of his grandson's eyes? The man called Eston was looking after John Rowlands. And his brother aboard, he said, He looked round at the 2 or 3 other men who had been standing near, and his face was grave. Something is not good. That was the 4th boat built by John Jones Aberdovey to go down in 3 months, and all of them new boats too. And it was not a great storm that took the Sarah Ellen, they say, only a heavy following sea. They are all the same, one of the men said. They dip the stern under. Every one of the vessels does it now. And then there is strain and leaks come, and down she goes. Not everyone, another man said. No, not everyone, that is true. John Jones has built some very good boats indeed, but the bad ones. I have heard it suggested, said the man called Eston, that it is not the design, but in the building, that it is not John Jones's fault at all, but one of his sawyers. And any work that he handles, he broke off, conscious suddenly of Jane's anxious stare, and switched on to his face a broad, deliberate smile. Waiting as usual, is it? Like all the young ones, but too polite to ask. He reached into one capricious jacket pocket and brought out a square package. Here, put some in my pocket for the first of you who would come smiling and begging. I did, and not for asking at all. You shall inherit it, little one. Thank you, said Jane, and for the 2nd time that day startled herself by dropping a little bobbing curtsy. Folded in paper in her hands, he had put 4 enormous wood-hard ship's biscuits. Off with you, said the man amiably. Into the oven in a dish covered with milk, isn't it, and a knob of butter on top. Lovely. Lord knows it is good someone enjoys the hard biscuit the way you all do. Not so good halfway across the Atlantic, I can tell you. But then you would swap the lot for a good warm slice of bar breath. The others laughed, and suddenly it was as if the last 2 words had turned a key back again to relock a door, for now they were speaking unintelligibly in Welsh together, and Jane knew that the difference was not in the language they used, but in her own hearing of it. She had been able to understand it for a short enchanted while. Now she could not. She clutched at Simon's unfamiliar stiff sleeve and drew him away. What's happening? I only wish I knew. There's no logic in it. Everything all mixed up. Where are we, and when, and why? The why is the biggest. Let's go and find Barney. I know, all right. As they walked over the broad, spaced timbers to the street, Jane glanced sideways at her tall brother. Somehow, in the rough old-fashioned suit, he seemed taller than ever, and more controlled. Had he changed too? No, she thought. It's just I wouldn't normally bother to think what he's like at all. They were walking up the road, past little cottages, gay with roses and snapdragon and sweet-smelling stock, past terraced houses, far grander and newer-looking than they had seemed in the days when they were yet to come, past a resplendent coaching inn, with its broad hanging newly painted the Penelig Arms. Two men, walking ahead of them, greeted a stumpy sun-tanned figure, standing in the doorway of the inn. "Good day, Captain Edwards." And we will pause there.